Welcome into the Hard Count. This is the People's College Football Show. It is Tuesday, July 2nd, 2024. Just a couple of days away from 4th of July. I know we're locking in. I know we got a lot of plans, probably getting out on the lake. Maybe some of y'all are going to the beach. Hopefully you're grilling out. We're going to dominate this week first, talking college football and only college football. And today, to help us do that, none other than the man, the myth, the legend, national columnist for us here at On3, Jesse Simonton. We're talking individuals who are going to have the largest impact on the college football playoff. We're talking biggest portal moves from this past cycle. Talking Ohio State, talking Bama. Like, we got a lot to jump into, so I won't waste too much more time. Without further ado, here is our conversation with Jesse Simonton. Let's go. Joining us now, long overdue, national college football columnist for us here at On3, the man, the myth, the legend, Jesse Simonton. Jesse, it's like I said, been way too long. I can't believe we haven't done this sooner, but thank you for making time to bless us with a little bit of insight on this show, man. How we doing?
I'm doing good, man. I'm doing good. Always happy to have a little time for Mr. J.D. Piquel, the rising star out here.
That is a lofty label and a very kind label, so I appreciate that. Man, let's talk a little bit about this college football playoff race, because Andy has talked about it a lot on his show. Like, we're kind of in that retraining our brains phase of things with this new college football and how it's going to look. A segment that I wanted to, or a topic rather, I wanted to unpack with you. Who are the most important people when it comes to this playoff race? Could be a coach, could be a player, could be a commissioner, I suppose. Is there somebody in your mind on the short list that you're like, hey, this is probably going to be a massive piece in who ends up hoisting the hardware January 20th in Atlanta?
Well, let's start with a player.
I love it.
You know, if we're talking about the 2024 season, let's start with Will Howard. Because I think if Ohio State has some real question marks, it's going to be around their offensive line. But I think they have at least enough there. And then it's going to go right to the quarterback position. Will Howard has the fourth best Heisman odds. I think that's extremely inflated, but that's what comes with the territory of being the quarterback at Ohio State. This is a loaded team. There was just a headline a week ago that I think they came out that they may have as many as 15, NFL draft picks trying to rival Georgia's all-time record. They're going all in. Ryan Day understands the pressure. He only got amplified with the comments by Jim Tressel and Urban Meyer. But I think there are real questions about who is under center for Ohio State. They moved on from Kyle McCord. You look at Kyle McCord's raw stats last year, JD, they're pretty good. But he was a little underwhelming, couldn't really hit the deep ball, maybe didn't get the most out of Marvin Harrison Jr. Now they bring in a guy who they feel like, frankly, maybe doesn't have the upside, I guess, of a Kyle McCord, but the floor is a lot higher. And so I'm curious, is the slightest margins, that's what's going to take, when you're talking about having to win 16, 17 games in this new 12-team playoff, can they get enough out of a Will Howard? I think he's a guy, if I'm kind of starting there, because I do have questions. I do have some questions, his accuracy can kind of come and go, the yards per depth, yards per target, again, a little iffy there. And yet, I think part of the reason why he is attractive and why maybe, they did go after him with such vigor and kind of pulled him away from the likes of USC and others is that where was Ohio State had issues? Where did they have issues last year? In the red zone. They couldn't score touchdowns. Will Howard, I think, provides some stuff with his legs, with his wheels, with his ability to kind of maneuver the pocket, navigate a little bit back there. And so he's kind of, if I'm talking about, guys that could make an impact or most interesting for the college football playoff this fall, I'm going to start with Will Howard. Who you got?
Jesse, typically you and I on Twitter, like, we have a lot of good interactions. A lot of them, though, it's like we have differing opinions, which is just, it's what the beautiful part about what we do is that we get to have that kind of banter, that kind of discussion. I have three guys listed. Will Howard is at the top of my list. Like, that was who I was going to mention next. And I think the interesting thing with him, you just mentioned his mobility. Like, I'm looking at his experience. Like, Kyle McCord, probably as physically gifted as he is throwing the football, I think he probably looks a lot better in a pro day than maybe he did last year for Ohio State. But I'm looking at the big spots, like against Notre Dame, where they took him all the way down to the wire. And he made some made some big throws to lead them on that final drive. He also had a throw in the red zone that probably should have been an interception end of the game. The game against Michigan, where quite frankly, you can't throw 2 picks and expect to beat a team that's as deep as Michigan is. So, like you mentioned, those stats I thought were solid, but like you said, when you kind of dial into things that Will Howard has that maybe Kyle McCord doesn't, I think Will Howard is a substantial upgrade just from an experience standpoint, from a mobility standpoint. Throwing the football downfield, I guess remains to be seen. I am so fired up to watch him in Chip Kelly's offense, though. I think that is going to do wonders for him. I think that backfield will do wonders for him, and I think he's going to have a really big year. It's one of the reasons why I'm Ohio and Ohio State, as well as I'm pretty sure everyone else is in the country at this point. I'll throw one out here. How about Pete Golding, Ole Miss defensive coordinator? Like, if Ole Miss is going to make some noise in the playoff and make some noise in the SEC, feel pretty good about the offense as long as Lane Train's running the show and as long as you got Jackson Darty back there and their plethora of weapons on the perimeter. The next step for Ole Miss for me is, can they play not elite defense, but just like more than solid defense? I think Ole Miss is going to be much better on that side of the football. Obviously, what they did through the portal, guys they had coming back like Suntarine Perkins and Ivy, like they got some dudes on that side of the football. If Pete Golding can maximize that talent, I think Ole Miss could be a very real player when it comes to making a playoff run. You buying that, or you selling that, Jesse?
I'm buying that. I'm someone that I do want. I'm kind of in the see it to believe it camp with Ole Miss and Lane. Just that he's a guy that historically has done really well at winning the games he's supposed to, and yet his defenses or just teams in general seem to get sliced through like a nice piece of sourdough when they play against the big boys. And so we saw them lose by 5 touchdowns to Georgia. They couldn't do anything, against an Alabama team that was really kind of spinning its wheels at that time a year ago too. But the additions of a Walter Nolan, a Princely Umaliaven, you bring in, some other depth pieces there, linebacker, the kid from Arkansas. Now this is year 2 for Pete. And so he certainly did, I think, make some strides with that unit a year ago. You see some of the defensive improvements and success rate, run defense. But now can they do that against the likes of, hey, can you go in and what sort of defensive effort can you have at night against LSU and Baton Rouge? How do you play against a Georgia team that, yes, it's going to be in Oxford, but that's going to be a loaded offense that, probably has as many dynamic playmakers when you're talking about tailback, tight end, and receiver together as any in the country. So I like that pick. Pete Golding has a lot on his shoulders. They're paying him a pretty penny. And, Lane has basically said, this is your deal. I just got you the groceries. You need to make it cook. So let's see if he can make it happen.
I love that. Just don't be sourdough. Is that too much to ask? Don't be sourdough against the big boys is what we're asking for here, Pete Golding. Who else you got when it comes to who could be maybe a more impactful figure on this college football playoff race?
Well, let's go a little bit deeper down. It's easy to think that Ole Miss is a team, at least, that has garnered a lot of buzz. Obviously, we both believe that Ohio State's one of the kind of favorites there. What about a team like Oklahoma? What about a team, let's just say as a program, maybe not a player. We can say whether it's Brent Venables or whether it's Jackson Arnold or whether it's just Oklahoma. Their win total is only 7.5. That's not a team that, certainly is entering the SEC in year 1 with a ton of expectations. And yet Venables just got this contract that, even though his overall record, 16-10, is rather mediocre, it's clear the administration there in Norman does not believe he's a mediocre head coach. And I don't believe he has a mediocre team this year, JD. I think if that schedule wasn't so gnarly, if they had Texas's schedule with this roster, I think their win total would easily be around 9 or 10 as well. I think they have done a really nice job in the transfer portal. Plus, you add in what they've done recruiting. I think Oklahoma is going to be a playoff spoiler. I don't think they're going to make the 12-team field, but I think they may negate a team or two in the SEC from perhaps getting there. And so I think Oklahoma, while they're not merely in that conversation of, are they going to be a Penn State or an LSU or one of these teams that if they don't make it, their fan bases are going to be pissed. I don't think Oklahoma is going to be like that, but I think Oklahoma may piss off some other fan bases by maybe giving them a loss or two down the road sometime in 24.
It is so bizarre to see that OU logo and then next to it the over/under 7.5 win total. It's like, wait a second, that brand and that doesn't usually go together. But I think you're on the money. Like, I think the defense is going to be really freaking good. Like Brent Venables coaches defense like chefs in Italy know pizza. He knows defense. I think the big question for me is, what do they get out of that offensive line? Like, if I'm talking about the most important figure with Oklahoma, Jackson Arnold's probably number one. Bill Bedenbaugh, the offensive line coach, might be the second guy for me in that discussion. So I'm curious how much they're able to get out of that unit as they replace pretty much that whole side of the line of scrimmage for them. But if they can protect Jackson Arnold and we get to see him kind of get his sea legs and maybe evolve sooner rather than later into that 5-star quarterback he was built out of high school, Oklahoma, like you said, they could be a thorn in somebody's side. That game where they host Tennessee early is one that I'm watching closely. I cannot wait for that one because it has storylines galore. Speaking of Tennessee, though, I got one more quarterback for you here, Jesse. How about Nico?
You got Nico?
Ava, man. Like, if he ends up being what we think he could be, like, does anybody want to see 2022 Tennessee in a 12-team playoff? Like, I think legitimately that's what we're looking at here with the ripple effect with the Vols and what Nico could be if he ends up finding his top end a little bit sooner rather than later. You buying that or selling that?
I'm buying that. I mean, I actually think that if Tennessee's going to be a playoff team this year, I think Nico is going to get a lot of the deserved shine, but it's going to be about Tim Banks' defense making an even bigger kind of ascension. They've kind of made gradual growth, gradual leaps the last few seasons under their defensive coordinator there. Now they bring back Pierce. They've kind of retooled that secondary with some transfers and some veterans. The defensive line is still, but they have a couple 6-year guys there. So I think Nico is going to garner the headlines, but it actually may be about some defensive growth because I do think the offense is just naturally going to be better. I think Nico is not only is he a more high upside talent than Joe Milton, I just think that he's going to be able to hit some more layups that Milton just simply bricked too many times. The receiver room is absolutely better because I think Brew McCoy, Thornton are both going to be healthier. You bring in Braswell from Tulane. You still have Squirrel Wright, Chaz, Nimrod, some of these other guys. You bring in the 5-star Mikey Matthews. So receiver room is going to be much improved. So offensively, I just think naturally they're going to take a leap forward. But I think defensively, if they make the playoff, that's actually where it's going to maybe be in the margin to be the difference.
And you've been all over that too. So folks, if you haven't yet been keeping up with all Jesse's work at On3.com, what are you doing? All right, dial in. My man's dropping heaters on a weekly basis. I mean, sometimes twice a week basis. So lock it over there and stay up with all the good stuff Jesse's doing. Jesse, any other figures you want to talk about in the playoff race before we move on here?
Yeah, let's go outside the SEC footprint for one. Here's a guy that I'm skeptical of, but maybe. What about DJU?
Ooh, I like this one.
Because Florida State, they're having to reload a lot, and yet they're still the favorites in the ACC. It's them, Miami, Clemson. Miami's never won the ACC. Clemson, have they done enough in the portal? No, they didn't do anything. So, can they actually win? We'll see. But I think the rest of Florida State's roster, what Mike Norvell has done in the portal has just been, he is the portal king because he has absolutely identified the right guys, not just the guys, but getting the right guys, hitting on them. Really like the kind of the train that they've built from Tuscaloosa. I think Roydell Williams, the nickel they got there, Earl Little, some of the other guys that you bring in, Marvin Jones Jr. From Georgia on as an extra pass rusher. But it's going to center around the quarterback. The reason they fell off immediately when Jordan Travis got hurt was because they didn't have anybody behind him. And so I'm not sure that there's anybody really behind DJ if he falters. So if the Seminoles are actually going to repeat as ACC champions, we're going to need to see DJ do something that he hasn't really done, which is play with consistency. And there's going to be a lot of pressure on him going back to the ACC. That game against Clemson is going to be super hyped. And the track record, I think, overall for a lot of these guys at their third stops probably isn't that high. Can he be an outlier?
Yeah, I mean, it's a fair question, but I'm so glad you brought him up. Like, imagine being a Twitter troll with all the DJU slander, and then he just goes and lights it up in the ACC his first year in Tallahassee. Like, that to me, just like selfishly as a college football fan and someone who enjoys the storylines, that would be awesome. And my stance on this, too, is like, why not DJU? Like, based on his best season at Clemson and what Jordan Travis did last year that was good enough to win the ACC, obviously the defense at Florida State carried a pretty substantial load in that ACC title race, but like I think it's not a wild stretch. Also, he's got, I would say, as good if not better weapons than he's ever had. He's going to have the best play caller he's ever had. He's now had more experience than he's ever had, if that counts for anything. So like I'm with you. I'm on the DJU train, and if for no other reason, I would just love to see him dunk on some of the punchlines that's been dealt his way since he's been playing some college football. But Jesse, let's pivot here to some of the more impactful portal moves. And you could probably put DJU into that category. When it comes to guys that are going to be, the more impactful names, or maybe the most, we'll look back and say this guy really changed maybe the complexion of the college football season because they got him on their roster. I'm looking at Dillon Gabriel at Oregon. And if they don't land Dillon Gabriel, I suppose you could say they still land Dante Moore. But like Dillon Gabriel, I think, makes Oregon a more serious national title contender, which I don't think is really a stretch. What are your thoughts on how he fits in at Oregon and maybe how serious you take Oregon with him now on the roster as opposed to without him?
I mean, that's a hand-glove fit in Will Stein's offense. This is a guy that I think, if people aren't that familiar with Oregon's offensive coordinator, came from UTSA where he was running, this crazy RPO, quick game, get it out, spit it out, and let your playmakers do the stuff with a lefty and Frank Harris. And now he's got this little, Hawaiian southpaw and Dillon Gabriel, who just led the Big 12 in passing, yards, touchdowns, everything, completion percentage. So I think, what we saw Bo Nix do in this offense a year ago, we may see even bigger numbers. Maybe not quite as much running. I don't think Dillon is quite the athlete of Nix, but he will take off a time or two a game. We saw that against Texas. Last year. But I think, absolutely, Oregon hit a home run there. Dillon Gabriel doesn't have like the NFL upside of a lot of guys in college football, but he is the quintessential college football quarterback. He's the type of guy that you want on in your program for 4 or 5 years because he's going to put up monster stats. He's going to win a ton of games. And so he is one of many marquee additions that Oregon made out of the transfer portal. You get the defensive tackles from Michigan State, Evan Stewart, who he's going to be throwing to, former 5-star from Texas A&M. Love that move. But I'm super high on Dillon Gabriel.
I mean, I think even just the fact that, like we talked about with Will Howard, the experience level that he has, where he's not going to walk into a game against Ohio State and have the shaky hands like we see that clip rolling around on Twitter. It feels like whenever someone's a little bit shook. I love that for him. I love that for Oregon. Who else do you think is maybe one of the more impactful or pivotal transfer moves that happened, whether it be in the winter cycle or the spring cycle?
Yeah, I'm going to go with Nick Scorton, the pass rusher who from Purdue, now at Texas A&M. He's a guy that he very quietly led the Big Ten in sacks last year, playing opposite of nobody, and that's pretty dang hard to do, JD, when you're playing on a team as terrible as Purdue, because it's not as if teams are having to pass a whole lot against you because your team is trailing most of the game. So impressive that he had just the sheer volume of hurries and quarterback hits he was able to accumulate. Now he goes to a Texas A&M team. Yes, they lose Walter Nolan and some other pieces, LT Overton and some other guys up front there, but they still have Shamar Turner. They still have Shamar Stewart. I mean, I think that defensive line by the end of the season could be the best in the SEC. And if that's the case, and if Scorton lives up to his first-round potential, then the Aggies could be another one of these teams where I don't think they're going to be in the playoff conversation, but they could be, they could pick off a team or two. Oh, what if they beat Texas at the end of the year, in that huge rivalry game on Thanksgiving weekend? How could that shake up the dynamics of the playoff? Scorton has that game-changing ability. So I kind of think that he was he doesn't have the name cachet of the Walter Nolans and the Dylan Gabriels and some of these other guys that have kind of been around. But I think he's a guy that fans need to know.
I was going to say that's one of those deep cuts from the portal that like he doesn't have the 5-star quarterback juice, but he's one of those guys that where if A&M wants to take that next step under Mike Elko, having a disruptor, game changer, game takeover kind of guy like a Nick Scorton feels like one of those pivotal pieces. Wouldn't it be the most college football thing ever, Jesse, if we get to that last game of the season? Let's say that Texas walks into Kyle Field at 9-2, A&M sitting there at like, I don't know, let's call them 7-4, and A&M is the team to hand Texas their third loss, bump them out of the college football playoff. 9-3, I think, is probably the cutoff in my mind at least. I mean, that would just be the most college football, most realignment, most Texas A&M rivalry kind of thing ever, would it not?
That's your Texas Pete hot sauce right there. I mean, that would be spicy. I'd like it.
Extra juice. Well, I'll go the other side of that rivalry. I am buying all the Isaiah Bond stock I can get right now, Jesse. I think he is going to be 1,000+ yard wide receiver, and I'm just like, okay, I think was good at Alabama. I don't know that Jalen Milroe or that offensive scheme period had like found their footing enough to really maximize him. Still averaged like 14 yards a catch, and you put that speed, that ability, that explosivity in Steve Sarkisian's offense, I'm like, okay, it's going to be, I mean, as long as Quinn Ewers doesn't lose his head, like they're going to be in really good shape, and I think he's going to make up for a ton of that production lost by Adonai Mitchell and by Xavier Worthy.
I mean, this may be showing my own age, but it's showing my where I was born in the South. But there's a famous Andy Griffith scene, which was way back in the 50s, where he's sitting there with Goober, the mechanic, and he's like, speed, speed, speed. That's all they ever want to talk about, and that is all you want to talk about with Isaiah Bond, because the dude is just electric. And I'm right there with you. I think he's going to be a match made in heaven for that Steve Sarkisian offense, especially because he's going to be, playing opposite of, Silas Bolden they bring in out of the portal from Oregon State, who's really good. They bring in Houston's best wide receiver. Oh, they have a 5-star, who just got his feet wet a year ago. So that Texas's receiver room is stacked, and it kind of starts with Isaiah Bond.
Dude, Andy Griffith, one of the best. Like, I think it's probably – maybe it's up for debate against, like, The Office in terms of theme song, but, like, intro theme song, the Andy Griffith Show with the whistle, like that, I think that's creme de la creme. That's just my opinion. That's another show for another time, but that's my opinion.
And that JD's saying that. He's a California boy.
Hit me with it. That's what I'm saying, man. That's what I mean. I feel like I've got a pretty even take on this whole thing, and I didn't grow up watching the Andy Griffith Show per se, but I know that theme song and I know that show, and I'm just telling you that. To me, that's on the Mount Rushmore. Any other portal guys that you think are kind of pivotal pieces to this whole 2024 season before we move on here, Jesse?
Yeah, let's go to a team that's kind of a team without a home, but that's kind of what they've chosen, the chosen path, and that's Riley Leonard, quarterback at Notre Dame. He's a guy who missed all of spring. This is one that I think, again, similar to DJU, I think this just kind of there's a lot of different avenues and ways that the Riley Leonard story could play out in 2024. Is he healthy? Is that if that ankle and everything is up to snuff, could he look like what he did 2 years ago when he led Duke to one of their best seasons in school history? If he does that, then Notre Dame, what sort of upside do they have as a program? I didn't realize this, JD, but when I did my unit rankings late spring, Notre Dame, their beat writer for our Irish site at On3 pointed out that they were the only team other than Georgia that made the top 10 of every single one of my top 10 unit rankings. So this is a roster that's pretty stacked. I mean, from Howard Cross and Benjamin Morrison and Xavier Watts on defense. And then I like what they've done in the receiver room via the portal with Bo Collins and the Mitchell kid from FAU. But it's going to center around the quarterback. And that's been kind of Notre Dame's, that's what's kind of capped them in recent years. And so can Riley Leonard elevate the program and kind of take them to the heights that they believe they should be at, or is he just not quite the guy and isn't healthy, and Notre Dame loses 2 or 3 games, and they're kind of saying, hey, we kind of squandered a cake schedule in a loaded season.
Again, multiple times a week. Jesse Simonton dropping bangers. If you missed the unit rankings, still time to catch up before we get into the season. But I'm with you, man. Like, that to me is one of the most fascinating situations in college football, because I'll be honest, like, I am a little bit probably more wait and see on Riley Leonard in terms of what he's going to do pushing the ball downfield. But if he unlocks that vertical pass game for Notre Dame, like you just mentioned what they got via the portal with Jaden Harrison, Chris Mitchell, Bo Collins, like Jeremiah Love as well out of the backfield as a weapon for them. Mike
Jeremiah
Denbrock
Love, yeah.
coming. Say it again.
I said Jeremiah Love, yeah. I mean, he's a really good running back, and you just about. I didn't mean to interrupt you.
No, you're great.
Teasing a Denbrock. If he does even a little bit with Riley of what he did with Jaden Daniels, look out.
I'm just saying. I know we're kind of getting into like the ifs and what ifs and potentialities, which I know probably most Notre Dame fans are like, hey, just let us play that first game and see how we look. But like the pieces are there and they're lining up to where if they hit with Riley Leonard the way that they could with that Mike Denbrock offense, could get scary. Could get very, very scary. And also the schedule to walk it further down the road there, very doable. Super. I mean, they could be in that 5 spot with 1 loss and be chilling. So
I think that Texas A&M game is going to be key for them, because the rest of their schedule is kind of cake. If they don't, and it's not to say it's one doesn't just walk into College Station and win a game, so they're going to have to show up and play well, even with the questions around the Aggies in 24. But because the rest of that schedule, you have Army and Navy, which they don't typically play both in the same season. They play a FCS team for the first time ever. If they don't win in week 1, they pretty much need to go 10-1 the rest of the season, or else they're not getting in. You lose. I think if they lose then to USC and Florida State, 9-3 Notre Dame's probably not making it.
Yeah,
not with this schedule.
Yeah, I mean, sorry, I didn't cut you off there either. I'm curious, even if like does 10-2 without a conference title game leave you on the outside looking in? It definitely doesn't put you in that 5 spot. So they're going to be fascinating, man. A lot of firepower out there in South Bend, which I don't know we've been saying for the better part of the last 5 or so years when it comes to Notre Dame. Let's pivot to another blue blood though here. You wrote a column on Ohio State, and it was well documented what Urban Meyer said about the roster, and Jim Tressel's high on the roster, and it's pretty much like, anybody with eyeballs that knows who these football players are at Ohio State, from Caleb Downs to Tui Maloau to Judge, like they're the Monstars out there in Columbus. Feels like this has to be the year where it's national title or bust. They're not backing off that. Is there a world where Ohio State doesn't win the national championship and there's still a somewhat decent approval rating for Ryan Day and co out there?
I think anything short of, I guess in this hypothesis, if they don't win the Big Ten, then I say no. So I do think they need to win the Big Ten, and that's a tall task when you're talking about Oregon's now in the conference. What is Michigan going to be, in a post-Harbaugh regime? But I think the Buckeyes should be the favorites to win the Big Ten, and likely will win the Big Ten. I don't see them tripping up more than once in that league. But then if you're talking about the 12-team playoff, if they don't win it all but they make it to the semifinals, I think that will still suffice. If they get tripped up earlier, or if they just get bludgeoned in a game against a Texas or a Georgia, there will not be, very many forgiving people in Columbus. I think, the irony of the comments, JD, that Tressel and Meyer made is that, they were kind of painting the picture that, well, it's certainly not going to be a player problem if Ohio State doesn't win this year. Because these guys, this roster is way better than the roster that we ever had. Now, as someone who covered Florida and lives in Gainesville now, it is funny to hear Urban talk about this being the best roster he's ever seen, when the 08 roster he coached and won a national championship with produced eventually, not necessarily that exact season, but eventually like some 30-odd NFL players. I don't, maybe Ohio State's roster will do that. Maybe they won't. But, in that column you alluded to, I do think the one concern outside of quarterback, which we touched on Will Howard at the start of this, is going to be the offensive line. It was notable to me that, in this 15 NFL draft picks that they may have, one was an offensive lineman.
Curious. Very curious if you're an Ohio State fan. But like you said.
So if you got one red flag.
That's the one. That's the one to keep an eye on. And I'm not so sure what to make of the offensive line exactly, because I look across this roster and I'm like, okay, a lot of first world problems if you're Ohio State, and there's issues, quote unquote, in Columbus. But I think you're on the money. Like Ryan Day, seeing Urban Meyer say that, he's like, hey, thanks guys, appreciate it. Yeah, that's really helpful as I'm trying to beat Michigan here for the first time in 3 tries. Like, I think if they beat Michigan, win a couple playoff games, I'm so fascinated to see how they treat the Big Ten title game as a fan base, because I personally would sit here in early July, late June, like I think Oregon's going to be a force. Like I think they might be my pick to win the Big Ten as we sit here early, just strictly because I think Will Howard's great. I don't know if he's like going to change the game for you against those teams, or if they play Oregon, they got to play him in Autzen and then probably play him again in the Big Ten title game. So I'm still waiting to see a little bit on that pick, but. Yeah, man, like I think you hit it on the head. It's got to be let's make a run in the playoff. Let's show that we maximize this roster, and maybe maximizing that roster, you bring it full circle, is winning the Big Ten. So, remains to be seen. The thought around Ryan Day's job is so interesting to me because guys won north of 87% of his games. However, I understand that the folks in Columbus expect, very black and white things. It's beat Michigan, win the Big Ten, win national championships. What do you make of all this discussion around Ryan Day and his job security as a guy who's lost single-digit games?
Well, I've written a lot about Ryan Day and Ohio State in the last 2 years, and I do think circling back to Tressel's own comments and Day acknowledging as much. Jim Tressel said, Ryan Day's done a really good job, or really something like that, a really good job, at Ohio State. And the difference between really good and great is kind of what Ohio State fans is that sticking point. And Day, to his credit, was candid enough to admit, that's what he has to do. And that means, winning the Big Ten again, which hadn't happened in 4 years. That means beating Michigan, which hasn't happened, 3 straight times. How much will we view this differently, JD, if that field goal at midnight, crosses the crossbars correctly versus going way wide versus Georgia? Probably a lot, because then they would have a national championship. And even if they lost to Michigan that year, you could still say, hey, we got into the dance and we won the dang thing. But they didn't, and they blew a lead in that game. And that's why it's so important that if they lose to this Michigan team, I do think that might be unrecoverable, even for a guy who's lost fewer than 10 games as a head coach, which is remarkable to say. But when you talk about all that Michigan has lost, and this is a game that will be, in the shoe, I believe, that would be tough to come back from.
No, I think that's 100%. Like the way that Michigan brings back so little from last year's squad, new quarterback, new head coach, new coordinators, like a lot of newness to where, okay, if you can't beat this Michigan team, we got to have a very serious talk at the least if we're Ohio State. And my question too, Jesse, is like if I'm Ryan Day, I understand there's a lot of pushback from the folks at Ohio State on what they haven't done on the field and not meeting expectations. I get all that. But if I'm Ryan Day, I'm still sitting there and saying I've lost single-digit games. Like I'm still, statistically speaking, one of the best head coaches in the whole freaking sport. At what point is it a matter of like, hey, just mutually, we both agree this is toxic. Like we're happy, 364 days out of the year together, but that every time a year passes and we don't get the rings, like that toxic couple that that they're just dating and they're not getting married, and every time they don't get married they have an issue and there's an engagement around them. Like I feel like that's Ryan Day and Ohio State, and I wonder, as much as it's wearing thin on Ohio State, how much this wears thin on Ryan Day and how much he's thinking, hey, I could go 11-1 somewhere else, and they would adore me. I'd be the man.
You're right. You're right. And what's also funny about all this is that Ryan Day has, I think, really attacked his own weaknesses with vigor this offseason. He has said, hey, I need to be a better CEO, so I'm going to cede play calling. Goes out and hires Bill O'Brien. Bill O'Brien gets poached, brings in Chip Kelly, has an insurance plan, right there. Goes extremely aggressive in the transfer portal, and that he gets their collective on board the second that Michigan wins the national championship. They raise like $1 million. Well, that money and many other millions have gone to good use to both retain the roster and bring in the likes of Caleb Downs, Will Howard, and Quinshon Judkins, and some of these other guys. And then you see what they're doing in the 2025 recruiting class, and it's like, this thing's set up for the engine to just roar. And so if you're Ryan Day, you're like, who the hell are you going to get that's better?
Yeah.
You're not going to go out and hire Kirby Smart. You're not going to, Kalen DeBoer's off the board. Who are you going to get that's better than me? And so it is kind of funny because it's almost like the Spider-Man meme where they're looking at each other like, all right, you're mad at me and I'm pissed at you, but like, yeah, we're in this together, and there's no way out.
I think that's kind of been his MO too since he's gotten there. Like, we remember the game against Oregon where Oregon comes in and runs for felt like 1 million yards in the shoe, and he goes, okay, nope, got to switch this up. That offseason, they go get Jim Knowles. Defense gets better. Now it's going to be one of the top units in the country heading in 2024. You mentioned the play calling thing with Chip Kelly. Like, he's continuing to, it feels like to me, evolve as a head coach. Where who's to say that Ryan Day, what he is this year in 2024, he's not a better version of that 3 years down the road? Because I think it gets overlooked a lot. Like, he'd never been a head coach, short of getting the keys tossed to him to be the head football coach at one of the most recognizable brands in the whole freaking sport. Like, he'd never done this before. There was no G5 build up to this. And so he's kind of figuring it out on the job. The comp I use a lot is it went from like, hey, he kind of knows how to play guitar to, hey, guess what? You're playing the Grand Ole Opry tomorrow. Best of luck figuring it out. Like, that was they threw him into the deep end and told him to swim, and he's done. I think as it's tough because the Michigan game is the black eye, but on paper, from a record perspective, like as good as you could ask for a first-time head coach in some respects.
Well, the irony here too is that what if he has a similar kind of come up, thank you, man, see you later as Jim Harbaugh? What if the Bears right down the road, they've been rumored to like Ryan Day for years, but have never pulled the trigger. If Eberflus falls, but then Day ends up, getting Ohio State to the semifinals or the championship game, but maybe they win, maybe they lose, but he says, hey, you guys aren't satisfied? I'll take my talents to the Windy City there.
And not have to recruit, not have to worry about NIL.
Exactly.
See my family a little bit more. Maybe take some gray hairs.
You can call those plays again.
Say it again.
Hey, you can call those plays again. You got Caleb Williams sitting there. I mean, there's a lot of ways that this could all, kind of play itself out, I think, for the Buckeyes in 24.
Worst situations to be in if you're Ryan Day. If you end up working in the NFL for an organization that has Caleb Williams playing quarterback for you. Last team I want to talk about here with you, Jesse. You mentioned Kalen DeBoer. My question for him, as with everybody else, I'll be honest, my doubt with him when he took that job from Washington going to Alabama was, all right, yeah, you can coach football. There's no denying that. Can he swim with the Sharks, though, when it comes to recruiting in the SEC? Still extremely early. But right now, Bama is pushing for a top 5, top 3 class, depending on what happens on signing day. What do you make of what Kalen DeBoer has done in a very short period of time on the recruiting trail out there in Tuscaloosa?
Yeah, I have a column on this at On3 that I encourage folks to go check out. I mean, I think that there was a lot of skepticism, and it was not unwarranted when he was hired. I kind of deemed it when he was hired that he was a fish out of water and an unconventional hire for Alabama, but that didn't mean he was a bad choice or couldn't swim with the Sharks, like he said. We just had to see it. And, he infamously had never signed a top 150 prospect. Well, he then, immediately beat out Auburn for a legacy kid and 5-star Ryan Williams. the wide receiver there, ends up keeping the bones of what Nick Saban built, and they inked the number 2 class. Okay, most of those guys were Nick Saban guys. Well, now in 25, they're not signing up to play for the GOAT. They're not signing up to play for the godfather of recruiting. They're signing up to play for Kalen DeBoer, who to date, as we sit here at the end of June, is recruiting as well as Nick Saban had been recruiting the last couple of years. And so that's just extremely impressive. And I think, as I noted in my column, they're not doing it the same way. And the new landscape of NIL, which Saban wasn't crazy about, seems to actually play better for a guy like DeBoer, who is kind of considered this X's and O's savant, game day wizard. Yeah, maybe he isn't quite as dogged in a living room. He doesn't have to be. If you are willing to invest the resources that your program has, and you hire a staff around you that really are, kind of in that, they're willing to go, rub grease and get their elbows dirty in the SEC wars of the recruiting, then you're going to be fine. And the Alabama brand doesn't seem to be losing any steam. And so if they continue to recruit the way they're recruiting right now, which, like you teased, I mean, it could be a top 3, top 2, top 5 recruiting class. I mean, that should scare the hell out of the rest of the country, because Kalen DeBoer, whether it was at Sioux Falls, where he won a couple, NIH championships, or Indiana, where he turned Michael Penix into who he eventually became, then what he did at Fresno State, and then, he took Washington from a 4-8 team to going 25-3, in 2 years. That was not with a ton of talent. And now he does have access to some of the best players in the country. And if they continue to land them and those guys continue to flock to Tuscaloosa, that's going to be bad news for, I think, a lot of other programs, especially a bunch of SEC schools that were like, hey, we're about to clean up in a post-Saban world. And it looks like that's going to be a lot harder to pull off.
And that's the thing. I feel like if you're a team that recruits against Bama and you've been going against Saban for the better part of the last 15 years, and you're like, okay, this is our chance now. Like the door is propped open. It's our time now. And then Kalen DeBoer does what he does right now on the recruiting trail. The scary thing too, Jesse, like if they win, if they start having success to where they're just playing for a conference title his first year there, and you can pitch the idea of, hey, this is step 1 of the DeBoer era. Step 4, step 5 is all the way up there. We're winning national titles. Like if you come to Alabama, Nick Saban's not here anymore, but you can still accomplish the same things you wanted to accomplish if you were coming here to play for the GOAT. Like at that point, it's kind of a chicken or the egg situation where, recruiting equals winning and winning equals recruiting. That to me would be the proof of concept that would terrify me from anybody else in college football, much less the SEC. That's where they really start cooking.
Absolutely.
It's interesting, man. It's very, very interesting. On the field for Alabama, I have bought all the stock I can in Jalen Milroe based on what Kalen DeBoer has done with quarterbacks over the course of the last couple of seasons, Michael Penix being the latest case. Milroe, obviously a different player, but I have to believe that, like I said, Brent Venables does defense, Kalen DeBoer does offense. Where do you sit with Alabama heading into 2024 in terms of maybe how optimistic you are when it comes to what they could do on the field?
I'm someone that is. I mean, I have Alabama. I think in my post-spring, post-portal rankings, I think I had them like 3 or 4. So I have them firmly as a legitimate national championship contender, not somebody that's in that 3rd or 4th tier. That I think some folks maybe had Alabama circled for this kind of 9-3-ish type season post Saban. I don't see it. I mean, and I'm high on Jalen Milroe's upside and potential as well. But I think, frankly, JD, this is going to be a team that's just going to be hell on wheels to block. And I would say that both offensively and defensively. I think the offensive line, when you get the boomerang transfer of Proctor coming home, you then get the center from Washington, who is an all-conference player. You have Booker there. I mean, what they have up front, that 5-man offensive line, it really started to gel by the end of the year. You saw it against Georgia in the SEC championship game. I think it could be even better this year. Then you add in the tailbacks, Jam Miller, Justice Haynes, what they have there. And I think Milroe's legs are going to be a huge focal point of the offense. Kalen DeBoer did not have to do that as much, obviously, with Michael Penix, but he has shown historically if he has a guy that can move, he's going to use it. And so I think Alabama, there are certainly like, how is a young secondary gonna grow? You know, they're gonna have some pains, I think, early in the season, but they got a couple 5-star freshmen there who they're super high on. Have they done enough in the portal? TBD. But again, I think that they, have a really nice defensive line that it's going to say, hey, that's going to assuage some of those issues if you can't block us. So
the new era of Bama football is here. It's so weird. Like, we're going to go to SEC Media Days in Dallas, and we're going to see the Alabama head coach take the podium, and it's not going to be Nick Saban. There's not going to be a whole lot of ites during that media segment, but nonetheless, it's around the corner. We are so close to college football. It feels like the confetti just dropped in Houston, and we have week 0, 50-some-odd days away, 60-some-odd days away? Like, it's here.
It's here. It's here. And when the game drops, I think that's when everyone's going to feel like the season starts.
And it drops during SEC Media Days. So
I don't know
what your plans are. Are you actively, recruiting people on social media to lend a PS5 and whatever the Xbox console is that we need to play with that now? Like, you have a plan of attack for that yet, Jesse? Because I'm still working it out.
I think I may start I'm gonna have you bring me a Progrum shirt when we're there in Dallas, and then I'm gonna start my program when I get back home post SEC Media Days. I think.
Done deal, man. Looking forward to it. Well, that's the best in the game. Again, took way too long to get this done. We got the man, Jesse Simonton, national columnist for us here at On3. Do yourself a favor. Check out his work at On3.com. Bangers multiple times a week, talking college football. Jesse, appreciate you as always, man, making some time. And we'll see you in Dallas, man, very, very soon.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me, JD.